Okay, we are live now, and I'm going to start streaming now, and we'll wait and see if anyone pops up in chat before I get a start. But yeah, we'll see what happens. All right, so I'm gonna start the music now. It's the Wilk Report. I'm Michael Wilk, coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio, doing a live stream eulogy for Star Wars, and I never thought I would have to be doing this because uh, when Disney bought Lucasfilm in 2012, I was cautiously optimistic because uh, it meant that we were going to see more Star Wars movies. Because we were just like what 6 or 7 years out from uh, Revenge of the Sith. I think that came out 2004, 2005 maybe. So it had been a while, and George Lucas wasn't getting any younger. His own kids weren't. I guess he decided they weren't going to succeed him in directing new Star Wars movies, and I think after the backlash to the prequels, he didn't really want to dive into it because the prequels were not as well received as the original trilogy, and I think a large part of the reason why the prequels didn't do nearly as well as the original, part of it had to do with the difficulties of trying to capture lightning in a bottle twice. It's a lot harder than it seems. But there's another aspect, and that is George Lucas as a storyteller when he doesn't have his ex-wife editing and uh, trying to slap his hands away from the keyboard, saying, "No, George, no, don't do this. Okay, you just violated your retconning." Uh, so yeah, I'm getting very low frame rate here. Uh, yeah, lots of red alerts here as far as my streaming speed, but unfortunately, I do not have access to uh, better Wi-Fi. So, uh, but yeah, so I'm gonna just keep going. All right, so if you're at all familiar with George Lucas, I mean, because the prequels basically did quite a bit of retconning. It brought the droids in, particularly R2D2 and C3PO, which I felt were unnecessary. I also thought Qui-Gon Jinn, the character played by Liam Neeson, was unnecessary because at The Empire Strikes Back, during the scene where Luke has been attacked by uh, the Hoth monster, the thing with the horns, kind of the Yeti-like creature, and he's escaped, and he's out in the snow, and he's freezing to death, and Obi-Wan's Force Ghost appears and says, go to Dagobah, there you will learn from Yoda, the Jedi Master who instructed me. So Qui-Gon Jinn in the prequels was really unnecessary. You didn't need him. All you needed was Obi-Wan Kenobi to meet Anakin Skywalker, and that was it. And then, of course, that Lucas couldn't seem to settle on whose story it was. Was it Qui-Gon Jinn's? Well, it was in the first movie. Was it Obi-Wan's? Well, it seemed to be in the second film, with Anakin's romance with Padme Amidala being a secondary story when it probably should have been the first. And then the third film, it was Anakin's and Palpatine's story, mostly Palpatine's. So, if you're trying to tell the story of how Anakin Skywalker fell to the dark side and became Darth Vader, it just came across as kind of ham-handed. It was still a lot better than what we're getting now, but oh my god. So, yeah, for those of you who are familiar with recent history, yeah, 2015, we got the awful The Force Awakens, directed by Jar Jar Abrams, which is nothing but a shallow retread of A New Hope with pointless fan service and doubling down on things that have been done before, because Jar Jar Abrams has no originality or any thought or care for the material he's adapting. Uh, so yeah, this is just awful in terms of how low Star Wars has fallen, because now we've got him back directing The Rise of Skywalker, and it's actually not The Rise of Skywalker. It's the rise of a Palpatine, who is usurping the Skywalker name because the Skywalkers were killed off in the new trilogy in ways that completely disrespected the characters. And it just makes clear that Disney either never had a plan or it did have a plan, which was simply to churn out movies in a never-ending saga of trilogies that would go nowhere and answer no questions because there was never meant to be an end. And the movie was shown to critics on Monday. It is now Friday, December 20th. But the movie was open to critics on Monday, and the reviews have not been kind. Rotten Tomatoes score, yeah, not all that great. So, I'm going to give you a little bit of history on Star Wars, and more specifically, a lot of the influences that went into the original. So, George Lucas was he's a baby boomer, born after World War II. He grew up watching, stuff like Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, and other Republic serials. So that was some of his early influences. And, he actually wanted to direct a Flash Gordon film. A lot of people don't remember that, but he wanted to direct a Flash Gordon film. The studios turned him down. After he got turned down, he decided to go off and do his own films, which were inspired in part by Flash Gordon. And that, of course, went on to become Star Wars, and, the rest is history. But, and of course, due to the success of Star Wars, we actually did end up getting a Flash Gordon movie starring Sam Jones and Max von Sydow as Ming the Merciless. But this is some of his early influence. And, then, there is, of course, World War II films. If you watched a lot of newsreels and historical stuff, you can't help but note the influence of World War II dogfights inspiring a lot of the space fight sequences in A New Hope. Because when the Millennium Falcon blasts its way out of Mos Eisley, then of course you go ahead and see the space battle right before they get pulled into the Death Star. A lot of this is inspired by that, and you can't help but notice all these influences. In fact, actually, another influence from World War II, if you pay attention towards the end of the first film, and spoilers for people who haven't seen it, and if you haven't, why not? It was over 40 years ago, so, after more than 4 decades, you've got no business complaining. But of course, we all know that, at the end of the first Star Wars film, they blow up the Death Star, and there's a ceremony giving Luke and Han medals for their bravery, although Chewbacca doesn't seem to really get one. I don't know why. And then, of course, there's the droids. But that whole scene, where the guys are walking down the aisle, and you've got all the rebel army on either side going, and they're going towards the platform to get their medals. That one shot was lifted directly from Triumph of the Will, directed by Leni Riefenstahl. Of course, Triumph of the Will was this Nazi propaganda film. Now, George Lucas is Jewish, okay? So, he studied, cinema. He went to film school, presumably. So, but he would have grown up, watching a lot of this stuff, and all this kind of poured into his brain and, influenced him heavily. And so you had, film school taking film history and film theory, and how cinema actually influences people. And, Triumph of the Will is still taught in film school because of its impact on the human psyche. And, yeah, George Lucas would have seen that, and he recreated that, a scene from that propaganda movie in the award ceremony for A New Hope. So, yeah, there's a little bit of history there. So, but he was also influenced by director John Ford and westerns of the 50s and early 60s. He was influenced by Akira Kurosawa because you can actually see a lot of influence. Because there's elements of westerns and, in fact, actually, going back to John Ford and westerns in general. If you look at Mos Eisley's Space Cantina, and this is actually where you see a lot of Western influences. They pull up to the cantina after Luke has agreed to go with Obi-Wan Kenobi after his parents were killed by Imperial stormtroopers, looking for the droids. And, so they go to Mos Eisley, and Obi-Wan says, never will you find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. And the whole sequence on Mos Eisley plays out like a Western, where they're going to this backwater Old West town, except it's on another planet, and it's like futuristic space technology and laser swords and ray guns, basically. And that's where we get our first taste. They go into the cantina, and right off the bat, Luke is making a bad impression. The droids are not welcome because there's an anti-droid bias. There's really, the scene where he runs afoul of the two bar patrons, and one of them gets his arm sliced off. That walrus-looking guy. Obi-Wan ignites his lightsaber and cuts the guy's arm off. Because he's warned him, this place can get a little rough. And Luke, obviously being a fish out of water, he's a country boy. He's a farmer. He's not someone who normally goes into town unless it's to maybe buy parts from the garage for his speeder or whatever. So so he's very naive at this point, and he needs people to get him out of trouble. And then, of course, we see the infamous scene between Han Solo and Greedo, the Rhodian with the bug eyes and the little flapping lips. And, this is something that George Lucas actually kept trying to tweak in the special edition version of the movie, where, he felt he didn't like the way the scene was originally written and executed, so he kept trying to make it so okay, Greedo shot first, so Han wouldn't look like a murderer. Well, Han was never a murderer, because again, we're seeing Western influences, okay? And that whole scene with Han Solo reinforces a couple of things. One, it establishes, it reinforces, just how rough a place Mos Eisley can be, and what the sort of things you need to do just to survive there. And two, it kind of introduces Han Solo as someone he's a good guy, and he can outwit at least a dumbass like Greedo, because Greedo is so busy gloating over a victory he didn't even have yet. He was so busy flapping his lips he didn't notice Han Solo drawing on him under the table, and so he ends up getting shot. But it establishes Han Solo as a good guy, but he's not so good that his nobility eclipses our main hero, who's Luke Skywalker. And so this serves, multiple purposes. And so, I think George Lucas really hurt himself as a storyteller by constantly going back and trying to retweak that scene along with others in the special editions. So, that's where we get the Western influences. And of course, then we get moved on to Kurosawa films, and the robes worn by the Jedi, like Obi-Wan and Yoda and, eventually Luke in Return of the Jedi, they're very much patterned on the robes worn by samurai without their armor. And Darth Vader's armor is patterned after the samurai armor of the Middle Ages. So, and of course, the lightsabers are meant to stand in for katanas, and katanas are actually two-handed weapons. They're not something you can, unless you've got a really powerful arm, you're not going to be able to really swing it much, because it's designed to be used with two hands, for sweeping strikes and bringing it down on an enemy instead of stabbing. So there's a lot of influence from Kurosawa films, and like Yojimbo and Seven Samurai, and then of course there's possibly the biggest influence of all, is J.R.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, because Luke is very much like Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. Okay, he's the guy who is a hero. He's our identifying character, the main one around whom the action is centered, and he's going on this hero's journey. And of course, Obi-Wan stands in for Gandalf, and later so does Yoda. Uh, but but interestingly enough, it's not Luke Skywalker who defeats Palpatine at the end of Return of the Jedi. It's Darth Vader, much like Gollum in Return of the King. And of Return of the Jedi, of course, is a play on the title Return of the King. Uh, but J.R.R. Tolkien, uh, when he wrote that ending, much like the reason he wrote the ending of The Hobbit, uh, we don't get to see the big final climatic battle between the heroes because it's Bilbo's story, and he's not a warrior. And Frodo, again, he doesn't defeat the ring. He doesn't defeat Sauron. He's not the one who casts the ring into the crack of doom at the end of Return of the King. Gollum steals the ring back from him, and he's dancing on the edge of the crack of doom, falls in, ring is destroyed. Because evil defeats itself. Tolkien's whole point was good doesn't always win because of heroes defeating the bad guys in battle. A lot of the times, evil defeats itself, and Darth Vader, who up to that point had been one of the bad guys, turns on his own master and defeats him. So yeah, we get a lot of these influences, and if you actually look at the original trilogy, with all these things going into it, I mean, how do you not see just how incredible this was? Because I was reading on Sean P. Carlin's blog, where he quotes Geddy Lee of Rush on what originality is, and I don't. I'm not going to quote it verbatim, but essentially what Geddy Lee was saying, originality is when you've got so many influences that you can't even remember all of them, and you kind of filter them through your own mind, and as you develop your work, your own voice starts to come out from all these influences, and it becomes uniquely your own. And that's what George Lucas did with the original Star Wars trilogy, is he took all these disparate influences from World War II films and footage of dogfights and stuff like Triumph of the Will, which again. Probably would have offended his Jewish sensibilities because, yeah, I mean, it's a Nazi propaganda film, but, it just goes to show you how powerful cinema can be. And, of course, with his wife at the time editing, and, after they got divorced, I suspect the reason he doesn't want the original trilogy unaltered being remastered and released on their own was because he didn't want her to get the royalties because she had at least partial rights over them for her job as an editor. So at least that's the rumor. I don't know if that's true or not, but so yeah. But there were other things. There were political subtext in there, and a lot of people are complaining about politics being inserted into the original, into the new trilogy, But here's the thing, politics was all about Star Wars because, I mean, the evil empire, again, patterned after the Nazis. The uniforms were patterned after those of Nazis. The stormtroopers, again, Nazi stormtroopers, Imperial stormtroopers, it's the same. A lot of it was inspired by things like the McCarthy hearings of the 1950s, where they did communist purges, and we overthrew the Shah of we installed the Shah of Iran after overthrowing the government there in the 1950s. We invaded Korea to try and stop what we thought were advancing communist influences, and Korea remains divided to this day because of our refusal to let go and let countries run themselves. And it was actually the Democrats who started the Cold War after World War II, because we had defeated the Nazis, and we were trying to show the Soviet Union, look, when we bombed Japan with a nuclear weapon twice, uh, that wasn't because we wanted to end the war and save lives. No, that was never the reason. We used nukes on Japan to try to frighten the Soviet Union into submitting to United States power. And that backfired because instead of backing down, the Soviets actually developed their own nuclear weapons, and we had this arms race ever since. And now we're in Cold War 2.0, which, people are falsely accusing Caligula Drumpf, that great orange dope, who was elected dictator in 2016. And, they didn't want him being conciliatory towards Russia. They wanted, they hated that Russia voted Boris Yeltsin out in the early 2000s because he was a pliant puppet for American interests. And Vladimir Putin, he's beholden to Russian oligarchs, but they're not our oligarchs. And so, we've been trying to get rid of him ever since because he won't play ball. So, when the Democrats blew the 2016 election after rigging the primaries and stealing the nomination from Bernie Sanders to give it to criminally corrupt Hillary Clinton, they've been trying to blame Russia ever since. Now, there's plenty of crimes that Caligula Drumpf has actually committed in office, from emoluments violations to misappropriating funds to pay for his border wall, from caging children and leaving them to be abused, often sexually abused, disappeared into the system, tried as adults. Kids as young as 3 or 4 being tried as adults without legal counsel in immigration courts to deport them. Seriously, people. Torturing children. That is a crime. And of course, there's war crimes, in Syria after the faked gas attack over there, because we've been trying to overthrow the Syrian government, and he's been trying to extract us from some of these conflicts that were started by Bush and Cheney and then expanded by Obama. So yeah, there's a lot of the McCarthyite ideology that had survived from the 1950s all the way to today, and this was very much still in the minds of George Lucas and his peers when they were doing Star Wars. Because the evil empire was actually a stand-in for, generally any authoritarian government, but it was more specifically the United States government and the hysteria and the authoritarianism that started kind of clamping down in the 1950s. And also, it was a Vietnam War allegory because, again, it was the World War II generation and the Cold Warriors who started the war in Vietnam. And George Lucas came of age during the 60s, and, he would have been part of that section of the baby boom generation that opposed the Vietnam War because we saw it for what it was, which is a war based on lies that didn't need to be fought, that primarily sent the poor to fight in place of the rich, because at least in World War II, everyone who was able to had to go fight. Rich, poor, black, white, didn't matter. That was a world war, and we couldn't afford to hold back able-bodied fighters. So, a lot of the politicians who ended up running the world later, like George H.W. Bush and Bob Dole, they were World War II veterans. And Bush Sr. had actually got shot down over the Pacific when he was fighting in the Japanese theater. And, but Vietnam, it was primarily a war waged by the rich, fought by the poor. And, that went on for roughly a decade. And, because again, we wanted to stop communism from spreading in East Asia. And, what they didn't realize was that Ho Chi Minh actually wasn't a true believer in communism. He was a nationalist, okay? He wanted Vietnam free of European and other Western powers. And he was lashing on to whatever system he thought would uh, bring the most, uh, the most likely to actually lead to Vietnam becoming uh, self-sustaining and able to defend its own interests. So, a lot of this stuff actually goes into the original Star Wars trilogy. And in fact, actually, Return of the Jedi, by that point, because it's 1982, 1983, and by that point, Lucas is a different person from what he was in 1977, and it's more of a conciliatory story between the generation that waged the Vietnam War and the boomers who opposed it, because you've got like 20 years or whatever since separating the 60s from the 80s now, and so there's kind of like a redemption arc for Darth Vader, because basically the boomer son is kind of redeeming his World War II father from his conservatism, and and the father kind of like recognizing that he really didn't do right by his kid, and or by his entire generation. Basically, a lot of the sentiment of the boomers was that their parents had kind of betrayed the ideals that they had been taught in school that America had held with the McCarthyite hearings and wars like Korea and Vietnam and stuff like that. So, yeah, there's a lot of that going into there. So, a lot of people are, who bitch and moan about politics being in the new movies. Well, they're barking up the wrong tree on this one. Because politics has always been present in Star Wars, and for all people like Freddie Prinze Jr., rant and rave and say Star Wars is for fucking kids. Yeah, yeah, real nice, Freddie. You're a father yourself of small children, and you're using the F-bombs while talking about Star Wars, which you say is for kids. Well, to the extent that he's right, yeah, it is for kids, but it's also for adults, and everything I've just spoken about here was in Star Wars, and the adults would have gotten that. People like me who saw it in theaters for the first time as kids, we didn't get any of that. We were the Generation X generation. The ones who came after the boomers, and we were the ones who put this stuff, but we never got the context. Our parents got the context. Our grandparents had the context. So there was a lot in it that was for them too, but you wouldn't have known it if you were a kid watching this in the theaters for the first time. And of course, you get the prequel trilogy, which kind of parallels the rise of the Bush-Cheney regime, but also kind of the Hitler regime over in Nazi Germany. And in fact, there's a comment on one of my earlier videos this week where an Iraq and Afghan war veteran said, look, a lot of this was, a lot of us who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, we kind of lived the prequels, because, this is exactly the kind of shit that was going on, in real time as the prequels were being made. And, because we had September 11th, and we went into Afghanistan supposedly to get Al-Qaeda, but then that effort was abandoned, just basically to occupy Afghanistan indefinitely. We let Osama bin Laden go, and it wasn't until, 2011 or so that Obama finally decided, okay, well, we've known for years where he's been holed up. He was basically a prisoner in Pakistan because they wanted to use him as leverage against Al-Qaeda, which was trying to make incursions into Pakistan. So, yeah. So they went in and took out bin Laden, and of course lied about how he died. I mean, he didn't try and use his wife or kids as human shields. He was captured, they executed him. Much like Saddam Hussein was executed because he was a key witness to a lot of the shit that the United States government had done uh, that was criminally negligent with regards to 9/11. And, because I'm not some conspiracy theorist. I don't believe in cockamamie bullshit like nanothermite or uh, planted explosives or remote control planes. None of that is remotely true. Uh, that's just people who've watched one too many episodes of X Files or Lone Gunmen and uh, believing the lies told by people who falsely claim to be architects and civil engineers. Well, they must have gotten their certifications out of Cracker Jack boxes because they don't even know basic metallurgy. Like, steel doesn't melt at 1500 degrees or 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, about the range that jet fuel burns. But it will weaken to the point where it becomes more plastic, malleable. And when steel is at that state, it's not going to hold up the weight of all those floors above it. Of course not. So naturally, it's going to collapse. So, I'm not someone who believes that, but that there is plenty of evidence that the Bush-Cheney regime was negligent with regards to 9/11. In fact, actually, former Senator Bob Graham had come out within the last couple years because he's privy to information that showed that, the Saudi government was involved in financing the hijackers, and apparently now we know, thanks to Freedom of Information Act, that the CIA was actually trying to recruit the hijackers to act as double or triple agents against Al Qaeda, and of course they failed. But that operation itself was illegal because the CIA is not allowed to operate within the United States, and here they were operating within the United States to go ahead and to try and recruit these guys, and they failed. And they protected these guys because they didn't want the operation being foiled by the FBI or other agencies. So there was a lot of clusterfuck of things going wrong where you had negligence, you had different agencies jockeying with the different operations, some trying to investigate and stop the hijackers, and others trying to protect them because they were trying to turn them into assets. So a lot of crap that just shows, because if any of this turns out to be true, and I think we need an actual investigation that's not a whitewash absolving people of guilt, I think you'll find that 9/11 was not only a massive intelligence failure, but it was also a clusterfuck of illegal operations that had no business going on, and rank incompetence. And that, to me, is a real conspiracy. Uh, but that you had stuff like that going on, and again, the contemporary politics of the prequels, was to show how liberty dies, by people handing it over to, with thunderous applause because, we were afraid, our leaders lied to us, they start wars that have no business being fought, then they take those wars and use them as a rationale to take away our liberties here at home. So, basically history repeating itself. And I think, that is something that people forget about George Lucas, is that, his movies were political. And yes, there was a leftist ideology within those political messaging within the first two trilogies. So, this extended rant I've been on for the better part of a half hour, it just is kind of give you background on all this stuff that people are complaining about within the new trilogy, but, they're kind of not really talking about that within the first two because George Lucas was involved in those. But he was a lot more subtle, and he didn't actually talk down to his audience. Disney talks down to its audience. It doesn't respect the intelligence of the audience to figure out things and understand what's going on. So it basically assumes that the audience is stupid. And that's what pisses me off more than anything else, because we've got a situation now where, because the studio assumes the stupidity of the audience, the scripts end up being dumbed down, and what we see on the screen insults our intelligence and treats us as though we can't figure out uh, things like subtlety. Uh, but then they also have fake woke politics, and a lot of people complain about SJWs in the new trilogies and in the Ghostbusters 26 movie, promoting wokeness or diversity for its own sake, and to the extent that the right wing SJWs are right, because there are right wing SJWs. Okay, a social justice warrior implies social justice war, and there are two sides in any war. So social justice warrior can mean you're either on the right or the left. And if you're on the left side, then yeah, you're probably going to want to promote diversity and what's called wokeness. It's really not, because what's uh, old school wokeness, and I tend to try and write my screenplays because I am a screenwriter. I've been to film school. I'm trying to write some screenplays, get them submitted. Uh, but mine is old school woke, in that in that more traditional definition of you're woke to what's going on. Okay, like you're aware of uh, the government lying to you about things, about large business interests lying to you about their product and how toxic it might be, like with Monsanto and its weed killer Roundup, and how glyphosate uh, causes cancer, and the genetically modified organisms that are sold as produce are modified to be able to absorb Roundup, which has that cancer causing agent in it, uh, without dying. Because Roundup is just basically, it's an herbicide, and it doesn't. And herbicides typically don't discriminate, and they kill whatever is exposed to them. So the genetically modified organisms are altered so that they can absorb this stuff without dying, but you're still getting all that cancer-causing stuff in it. So so basically, being woke means you're aware of these kind of things, and what's happened with the social justice war is that you've got people on the right uh, attributing wokeness to being like agenda pushing for diversity, and uh, kind of taking away uh, white people's rights by promoting the rights of traditionally oppressed groups, people like blacks, Hispanics, women, LGBTQ, whatever. Uh, and they act as though, somehow promoting these somehow takes away from us. Well, no, it doesn't. But hey, that's what they want to believe. Uh, I think it's being fundamentally dishonest. And I've got a comment saying I keep crashing for a minute. Yeah, that's the hazards of streaming with the poor Wi-Fi connection. Is that the the bit rate keeps dropping, so I don't. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm in an area that doesn't have good Wi-Fi, and yeah, so that's on. Getting back to what I was saying. So you've got people on the right who complain about this so-called wokeness, but on the other hand, yes, you do have people who claim to be on the left, supposedly promoting all this stuff for equality, but it's corporate wokeness. It's empty wokeness, because it's being used basically to market to target demographics. Because the way corporate mentality works is they do research studies to try and figure out how to market product to different groups, because they want to know the demographics of the people they're selling to. And what they're looking at when they do these research studies is that, yeah, customers are becoming younger as older generations die off. They're more diverse, racially and ethnically, religiously diverse. Uh, there's a lot more people out of the proverbial closet now than there were 30, 40 years ago. So, they're looking at these statistics and they are tailoring their marketing to these target demographics, figuring that wrongly that the Gen Xers who grew up with this stuff and the boomers who created Star Wars, uh, they don't seem to be aware of physical media anymore and how we uh, pass our love for these properties onto our children and our grandchildren. So, yeah, back. Okay, yeah, I'm back. And gone again. Yeah, so I'm. Yeah, I do apologize. I'm recording this as well as streaming, but so I will have this up on the channel probably this weekend. Uh, but yeah, there's a lot of cutting out, and unfortunately, I'm just not in a position where I have access to good Wi-Fi. So, uh, yeah, so hopefully I'll be back again soon. uh, all right, so all right, yeah, I'm back, and I'll probably be going again in a minute. But yeah, so there's a, but so like I've been saying, and uh, Stephen, I hope you'll tune in when this finally uploads and processes. But yeah, the yeah, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it in its entirety, and I'll upload the recorded version uh, later this weekend. So, but yeah, what we've seen here is targeting to specific demographics and at the expense of ignoring the demographics who actually made this property so well loved in the first place. So Disney buys Lucasfilm from George Lucas for over $4 billion, and because Lucas wants to ensure that the outline he has for the sequel trilogy is actually implemented, he puts in charge at Lucasfilm someone he thinks is going to be on his side, Kathleen Kennedy, who's been the producer on Lucasfilm and Steven Spielberg's movies. Uh, but the problem is Kathleen Kennedy is a yes woman and a shameless suck up. She tells her bosses what they want to hear and carries out their wishes. So, as it turns out, she was no ally to George Lucas. So she basically did whatever Bob Iger demanded. And what Bob Iger demanded was to churn out Star Wars movies every year, like on a factory conveyor belt, which meant having to undo the end of Return of the Jedi, which ended the Star Wars and Skywalker story, pretty definitively. Uh, the extended universe was, for some reason, not considered viable for turning into movies, and I suspect it has something to do with the rights issues over, because a lot of authors they get and publishing companies they get licenses to produce this content, and I suspect, although I cannot prove for certain, that a large part of the reason why the extended universe was rendered non-canonical was because of those rights issues. Yeah, because trying to pick one and go with it would it would mean having to pay out royalties and lose money, paying out those royalties to various authors that Disney just was not prepared to do. And Jar Jar Abrams, who was brought aboard to direct Episode 7, wanted to do his own thing. Now the thing about Jar Jar Abrams is that he is a no-talent hack. He is shallow, one-dimensional, fundamentally stupid. I mean, he's as far as being a movie maker, he's the only thing he's really good at is mimicry and doing the technical aspect of movie making. He's not an auteur. He doesn't know shit about actually telling stories. He's all about pushing a marketing gimmick, that magic mystery box, which is basically, if you're not familiar with that, there's a video on Cracked that goes into the 5 reasons movies suck today, and it actually exposes the Magic Mystery Box for what it is, which is all the cheap shit that the Magic Store couldn't give away, so they toss it all into a box, charge you $15 for it, and claim it's $50 worth of magic, but it's probably closer to $5, so you're overpaying by $10, for crap. And that's the Magic Mystery Box, and that's what Jar Jar Abrams excels at promoting, because at the end of the day, that's all he's got. All right, the reason why his movies are so fast-paced and don't give you time to digest what you're actually seeing was because if you actually had time to think about what you're seeing within that time frame that you're watching the movie, you wouldn't like it. You would probably get up and leave and demand a refund. So, he threw in Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber into The Force Awakens with no explanation for how it even got there, because the last time we saw that fucking thing, it was tumbling down a ventilator hole in Bespin Cloud City towards the planet below, a gas giant, never to be seen again until Dark Empire brought it back, postulating what if they found Luke's hand, and they used that to make a clone of him, which inherited his Force powers, and then that's where they introduced Mara Jade, the Emperor's Hand, whose job was to assassinate Luke Skywalker, and she ended up killing the clone, but falling in love with the original. So, but if you're going to resurrect that element, you could have that as an explanation for how the lightsaber gets recovered, but they did away with that. So, there's no explanation for why Luke Skywalker's lightsaber from A New Hope gets into The Force Awakens. You're not meant to know. It's one of those setup questions that's never meant to be asking, and Jar Jar Abrams and Ruan Johnson and Kathleen Kennedy treat you like scum for expecting there to be any payoff or any answers to the questions being set up to never be answered. So yeah, so you had pointless fan service, you had alterations to the Millennium Falcon, to C-3PO, and Harrison Ford agreed to come back for The Force Awakens with the proviso, presumably, that Han Solo would be killed off, because it's no secret that Harrison Ford was done with the original trilogy after he did Return of the Jedi, and he wanted nothing more to do with Star Wars. Okay, he moved on as an actor. He had a very successful career in his own right, doing Indiana Jones and Jack Ryan and all these other films that he's been in. He wasn't keen on returning because, he is in his 70s. He doesn't want to be pigeonholed in his in the twilight of his career into doing Star Wars again. So, yeah, they decided they were going to kill off Han Solo in The Force Awakens, but the way they did it was to make him die like a bitch at the hands of his own son. You could have had him go out in a blaze of glory, but no. And then, of course, you make him into a deadbeat father who abandoned his wife and kid after the kid turned to the dark side. Come on. Basically, you destroyed Han Solo for no good reason, because Jar Jar Abrams doesn't know how to tell a good story. All he had was a directive from Kathleen Kennedy was, we have to undo everything that was accomplished in the original trilogy so that we can, keep going and, make it a forever story that never ends. So Jar Jar Abrams did what he was told. And, basically, Jar Jar Abrams, was the worst choice you could pick to direct a Star Wars movie. They could have put Ron Howard in and had him direct. You could have put Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni in and put them in charge of doing the movies, but they didn't want to. And in retrospect, yeah, The Mandalorian doing quite well on Disney Plus. A lot of people like it. I'm one of them. That they've got people like Deborah Chow and Taika Waititi directing episodes, Dave Filoni directing episodes. So yeah, they've shown what they can do with fan service that's done right and that actually advances the plot. Jar Jar Abrams does fan service just to push nostalgia. It's like, oh hey yeah, remember this? You liked that before, like it again. Yeah, that's what he does. So then Jar Jar Abrams leaves to go work on other stuff after The Force Awakens because, by his own admission, he's no good at actually finishing stories. He just starts them and leaves them for other people to have to deal with. So then Kennedy decided, well, I didn't like the nostalgia pushing that Jar Jar Abrams relied on, so I'm just going to put in someone who's never really directed a major movie before. I'm going to get Roundhead Ruin Johnson, a boy who hates Star Wars, who hates his audience, who is actually on record in interviews saying, my idea of a movie that I like is where half the audience gets up and leaves in disgust, which is, the approach he took with Brick and Looper to his two previous movies before doing The Last Jedi. And The Force Awakens wasn't even finished shooting when he started writing the screenplay for The Last Jedi. And of course, he completely disregarded whatever plan may have been left behind. There's conflicting toss him under the bus reports that Jar Jar Abrams had a plan that he left behind for Ruin Johnson to follow and that he tossed it in the trash. Other reports say that there was never a plan in the first place except to churn out movies. So yeah. Then there's, and of course, The Last Jedi was nothing but one big insult. It had side quests by minor characters that led nowhere, that were pointless, that, again, the political messaging was ham-handed. It talked down to you. It assumed that you were stupid. And, so naturally, yeah, a lot of people did hate Rose Tico because she was a shallow one-dimensional concept masquerading as a character. No real development. And then, of course, she's all hot to free these space horses, but then she leaves the kids behind to remain enslaved, like actual children, like sentient species children who are enslaved. They get left behind. So she doesn't give a shit about them. I mean, if she were truly, progressive or liberal, she wouldn't have stopped at freeing the animals. She would have freed the child slaves too. But no, she leaves them behind on Canto Bight to suffer whatever backlash the rich assholes there uh, would take out on them because, yeah. So, but yeah, there's your fake wokeness there. So, so obviously The Last Jedi polarized fans a great deal. Made roughly half as much as The Force Awakens did at the box office, but probably cost about as much because it's over 2.5 hours worth of movie, and you don't you don't make that kind of thing by not spending tons of money. So I mean, with the money it costs to make that thing. In fact, actually, if you go over to World Class Bullshitters, they actually have this chart that shows, the dynamics of how much Disney needs to make on each movie in order to turn a profit on its investment in the Lucasfilm purchase. Because they, like I said, they shelled out over $4 billion to George Lucas to acquire Lucasfilm and Industrial Light and Magic and Star Wars and all these other properties owned by Lucasfilm. And they need each movie to make a minimum of $659 million in profits. And if you're not making that much money in profits, guess what? You're not going to be able to pay for that theme park, Galaxy's Edge. Which is largely deserted because the only thing it has going for it is the life-size replica of the Millennium Falcon, and that's about it. It's not worth the inflated ticket price, and so people are staying away. They've no interest in going to see an attraction that only has one or two points of interest and nothing else. So yeah, Galaxy's Edge is a failure, and that has largely to do with The Last Jedi being so divisive and Disney being so heavy-handed trying to recover its investment, where they will overcharge and think that you're stupid enough that you'll pay for it. So after all this, and after Solo, a Star Wars story, lost money at the box office, the first to ever do so, because Kathleen Kennedy decided, oh well, the two directors are shooting stuff that has nothing we can use for what we want, and their lead actor can't act. They had to have an acting coach come on and hold his hand throughout the entire production. So you know what? You guys are fired. Replaced them with Ron Howard, who is a talented director in his own right. Don't get me wrong. He's incredibly talented. He directed Willow. He directed he directed Philadelphia. He directed Apollo 13. He's directed the Da Vinci Code movies with Tom Hanks. So he's very good as a storyteller. He knows how to direct. He knows how to write. He knows how to tell a story that makes sense. And but the problem is with Solo was they ended up making one movie for the price of two, because most of the footage that was shot by the previous directors didn't even make it into the final cut. So essentially they had to almost completely remake the movie. And at that point, if you have to essentially remake the entire movie because most of what you shot is unusable, well, you might as well just replace the lead actor, because why pay someone who can't even do the job adequately when you've got Anthony Ingruber, who looks and sounds like Harrison Ford, a young Harrison Ford, and actually nailed it in his own homemade audition video. He nailed it. You could have hired him. He's actually played a young Harrison Ford on another movie, but no, they didn't hire him. They stayed with Aaron Rettenbacher, Ehrenberg, however you pronounce his name, but they chose to stick with him. So he couldn't sell the movie because he couldn't act. And then they decided, oh, well, we're going to have Donald Glover playing a young Lando Calrissian. Oh, well, we're going to make him pansexual so we can pander to LGBT people. And, of course, we're going to make him, much more Afrocentric than Billy D. Williams portrayed in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, because reasons. People don't like being pandered to. And, when you fundamentally alter a character like Lando Calrissian, just to try and pander to a demographic that probably wasn't even interested in that to begin with, because they didn't see Lando Calrissian as someone who necessarily needed to represent them. But again, corporate politics, they have to sell to target demographics. That's part of the target demographic that they're trying to appeal to. So they shoehorn that in and kind of destroyed Lando Calrissian as a character. But here's the thing. And if you notice from The Force Awakens, when Finn, played by John Boyega, turns on his fellow stormtroopers and joins Poe, he doesn't have a name. He's got a serial number. And so, Poe, he doesn't want to call him by a serial number, so why don't we just, your serial number's FN something or other, well, we'll just call you Finn. And he says, oh yeah, Finn's a good name, yeah, right. So they do the same thing with Han Solo in his standalone movie. He doesn't have a last name, well, we'll give you one, you're here solo, so we'll just call you Han Solo. That was completely stupid and contrived. You didn't need a reason to give him the name Han Solo.